take my original question of what if the role of the blacks and the whites in apartheid were flipped around?
As I said in the description of this video, if apartheid were taken exactly this as it was and reversed, in other words, every single law that was implemented during apartheid were to be implemented again, but whenever it was targeted at black people, it would have been targeted at white people, and you took it exactly the same word for word, not only would have the South African economy been in a better place, but Afrikaners and white people in general that are currently the persecuted minorities in South Africa would have also been in a massively better place.
What do you mean by that?
When we start talking about apartheid as a whole, the most important part of apartheid and also the most influential policy within apartheid was the creation of the so-called homelands or Bantustans for black South Africans. The government classified black South Africans as citizens of their respective ethnic homelands rather than South African citizens. Now, what this means was that even before these Bantustans were fully recognized as independent and sovereign, like some of them were during the end of apartheid, black South Africans were considered citizens of their respective ethnic homelands. And in essence, the biggest thing that's important in this sense were that these people did not have to pay taxes in South Africa unless they worked in South Africa. If they were productive within these homelands, they had zero obligation to pay any taxes to the South African government during apartheid. If the current government were to implement policies like these and create a separate homeland for Afrikaners, it would have been massively beneficial to Afrikaners in South Africa, as they then did not have to pay taxes to the South African government, just like what happened during apartheid, if they were productive within their homeland.
You see what apartheid revisionist Willem Petzer says about it. According to Mr. Petzer, the Boers, or whites in general, if you had split them up and applied the sort of Bantustan homeland system and split them off from the blacks, in my thought experiment of flipping the races around in apartheid, the blacks would be in charge if they were the government and they split off the whites into homelands. What Willem Petzer says, the whites in general and the Boers more particularly would have just proceeded to build a great folk in those homelands. He's sort of alluding to the fact that the blacks didn't, right? Now, I can see why some people would emotionally, just listening to that on the surface, why some people would just emotionally believe that, because that is something Boers have done, right? They've gone to a place and have built. Much of South Africa was built by them, right? So I can see why you would believe that. However, there's just a little problem. When it comes to this idea of apartheid being flipped around, you must understand those white people in those homelands would be living under apartheid laws. They wouldn't just be split off and free to do as they want. I think Mr. Petzer leaves out a few things, don't you think? Especially when you consider those people would be living under apartheid. This would not be let the Boers go because they lost the war and surrendered the fight. If things were flipped around and the Boers and the whites in general were under the same condition blacks were under apartheid in the homelands, you should not leave out the actual apartheid part, Mr. Petzer, such as,
over the following centuries, black Africans were segregated onto so-called native reserves. And by the 20th century, that meant 70% of the population was living on roughly 13% of the country's land. Deprived of their traditional livelihoods and seeking to escape these overpopulated regions, black Africans began migrating to white-controlled areas. There, they worked for low wages on white-owned farms and mines, alongside the descendants of enslaved and indentured workers from across Africa and Asia. By 1948, this exploited labor force was a primary driver of South Africa's booming economy. But economists argued that continued growth required a stable, educated, and urbanized African labor force. The ruling United Party accepted this logic, but the rival National Party argued such a workforce would threaten the white ruling class, naming their campaign apartheid, the Afrikaans word for separateness. The National Party won the 1948 elections. And once in power, they began forcibly relocating millions of Africans back to the reserves. Under apartheid, black workers were considered temporary visitors in white areas. They were restricted to specific zones, and their trade unions received no official recognition.
Living in a homeland was a controlled system, ruled from Pretoria, as to how you could develop and how far self-rule could go. Where do you think people like Bantu Holomisa gets his fame from? It is not because he's a firecracker of a politician. You've seen the man talk and be interviewed. He's not actually that convincing, and he hasn't gained much prominence as a politician for that fact. But he's still one of the most respected black politicians in this country. Why is that? If you crack open a book, it's because he tried to perform a coup and tried to really self-rule, because homelands couldn't actually rule themselves.
December 30, 1987, the Transkei coup d'etat was a bloodless military takeover in the unrecognized South African homeland of Transkei, led by 32-year-old Major General Bantu Holomisa, chief of the Transkei Defence Force. The coup ousted Prime Minister Stella Sinkao's government. Holomisa suspended the civilian constitution, resisting South Africa's push for civilian rule, arguing that such a government would be a puppet controlled by Pretoria. Despite a failed counter-coup in 1990, Holomisa's military government remained in power until Transkei was reunited with South Africa in 1994 following the first democratic elections. A military rule medal was introduced to commemorate the coup, though its official details remain unclear.
Of course, he was outpowered and really outgunned and had to just hold in that position from 1987. And remember, that coup only happened in 1987. Already on the brink of apartheid. Before then, things were much tighter, and he wouldn't have actually gotten away with it even 10 years before that. And the reason why the black population of South Africa had to turn to asymmetrical warfare and the struggle movement itself is because in homelands, you couldn't just build, you couldn't just rule yourself like Bantu Holomisa tried to do. He had to try and do a coup against Pretoria to do it. Can you see that the homeland is not independent? It's not some independent state that can just build by itself. And he was not allowed to just rule himself, because then he would have his own ideas and build his own things, just like Mr. Petsa imagines the Boers would be able to do if apartheid were flipped around. But you wouldn't, because Pretoria would then crack down on you.
And now we were a little bit worried about South Africa as well, as to what must we do.
The members of the new military council who are running the country are responsible people. They are loyal to Transkei, and they are also friends of South Africa.
Just like they did on Bantu Holomisa, and he was only able to hold out because he did it in 87, and that was already the dusk on apartheid. Apartheid was basically was coming to an end. Mr. Petsa mustn't also forget that if the whites were put into homelands, the homelands weren't independent states. They were labor settlements, and the townships was the labor compound. You came from the labor settlement to the labor compound to the job in town, and then back to the compound, and during the holidays like Easter, back to the homeland, which is the labor settlement. That was the actual system. It was actually very diabolical, very clever in the evilest way.
If we look at the specific laws of the Bantustans, we can look at, for example, the Bantu Authorities Act of 1951, which established a local authority to govern every single one of these black homelands as a sovereign nation, even within a nation. And also there was the Promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act of 1959, which divided black South Africans into ethnic groups and assigned them to their respective homelands, giving them citizenship within whatever homeland corresponded with their ethnicity. And then finally there was the Black Homelands Citizenship Act of 1970, which took away the citizenship in South Africa of black people within the homelands and made them only have citizenship within their respective homelands.
The homelands were places where raw materials were extracted and shipped from the homelands into the major business centers. Soldiers patrolled homelands, even the mine dumps. People who grew up in apartheid would testify to that, both on the white side and on the side of the blacks. They would break up weddings. They would stop your car at will. They would beat people. It's not just a place where you can have an independent state and build. It's not like that. It's a labor settlement. You have restricted freedoms. So who would you trade with? How would you build? You're not a free state, to borrow a phrase. You are a limited entity of Pretoria. Thank you for listening. If you dare, buy us a coffee. The link is in the description.
Why are you running? Why are you running?